We are and always will be a nation of immigrants.
This is my country, my damn country. Give me my country, you can keep the rest.
Bold men and women yearning for freedom and opportunity who leave their homelands and come to a new country to start their lives over.
We were strangers once too.
My country, my damn country. Give me my country, you can keep the rest.
Hello, 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 aliens and allies. Your friendly Russian is here. This is We the Aliens podcast, and I'm your host, Sasha Kapustina. Thank you for tuning in. Wow, what a week. How are you holding up? It was crazy. This week on the podcast, the second part of my conversation with journalist and activist Asra Nomani. I delayed it because I didn't want it to get lost in the storm of last week's news. Not that we can expect this week to get much better, but if anything, the events on Capitol Hill only highlighted the themes that Asra and I talked about. The danger of extremism, the importance of standing up to racism and anti-Semitism, and the vigilance required in pursuit of justice. I hope you listened to part one of the interview with Asra, but in case you didn't, here's a quick intro and recap. Asra Nomani is a former Wall Street Journal correspondent. She has written for the Washington Post, the New York Times, Time, and basically every publication under the sun. You've seen her on CNN, you've heard her on NPR. Asra talks about extremism and Muslim reform. She was born in India, she was brought to the US as a young child, and she grew up in a conservative Muslim family. She also talked about how she only finally integrated into American society in her late 20s with the help of her dear friend and Wall Street Journal colleague, Daniel Pearl. Asra was also the last person who saw him in Karachi, the day when he got kidnapped in January of 2002. You may remember his name from the news. Daniel Pearl became the first Western journalist to be beheaded by the Pakistani militants. His murder was filmed and parts of it were shown on TV. This happened just months after 9/11. And only added to the shock of that time. In the moment when those images were shown on TV, life split into before and after for the journalist community. Because for them, it became crystal clear that Geneva Convention is not going to be protecting them in this war. In fact, their press ID and vest are making them a target. Daniel Pearl became a symbol of courage and standing up to extremism and anti-Semitism. His widow, Marianne, wrote a memoir that was adapted into a film starring Angelina Jolie. His name was added to the Holocaust Memorial on Miami Beach as the first non-Holocaust victim. International Press Institute named Daniel Pearl one of its World Press Freedom Heroes. And the former mayor of New York, Ed Koch, requested that his own tombstone be inscribed with Daniel Pearl's last words. "My father is Jewish, my mother is Jewish, I am Jewish." There are schools and awards named after Daniel Pearl. There's an annual lecture at UCLA. Christopher Hitchens, Anderson Cooper, and Larry King have delivered their lectures in the past years. And this year, CNN Jake Tapper will be speaking on February 2nd. And so Daniel Pearl's name lives on as a symbol of journalistic integrity and courage. The terrorists didn't manage to erase it. Here's the second part of my conversation with Asra Nomani. We pick up on the day Daniel and his wife Marianne arrived in Karachi.
So Danny and Marianne came to visit me on January 22nd, 2002. And Danny had a big interview. He was on the trail of this guy that he thought was the facilitator for a man named Richard Reed. The reason why we take off our shoes when we go through TSA is because this guy, Richard Reed, tried to light his shoes on fire and have this explosive go off on a flight from Paris to the US in December 2001. Everybody thought that it was, the next wave of 9/11 type attack. Mm-hmm. There's a story that had been written in the Boston Globe that the facilitator for Richard Reed was a man by the name of Sheikh Jilani. And so Danny was on the chase to get an interview with this Sheikh Jilani. And he met a man who claimed to be a student of Jilani's, and that man said that he could set up an interview for Danny. And one day, Danny texted me and said, "I'm coming to Karachi, And that's because he had scored this big interview. I was so excited, that my buddy and his wife were coming to town. I ran around. I got fancy bubble bath for Marianne because she's pregnant. And I was like, she needs a good bubble bath. And I got beer because there's these bootleggers in Pakistan.
Wow. In
Yeah.
Karachi, you got beer.
Oh yeah, they literally, the elite have the bootleggers' names and numbers on their cell phones to order. Yeah, whiskey and beer. And I was just going to show my friend a good time, right? Like the kind of joy that he taught me that we could have in this world. And I was just, ordered biryani that night, which is like delicacy. And my friend came, unbeknownst to us, this man who had set up the interview had lured Danny into a trap. His real name was Omar Sheikh. He was this British Pakistani kid who had gone to London School of Economics. He had dropped out to become a jihadi in the 1990s. He had gone to India to kidnap tourists on behalf of the Kashmiri militant groups. He got caught and he went to jail in India for 5 years before hijacking by militants freed him in a exchange, of prisoners in India for the passengers on the plane. So this guy, Omar Sheikh, was now running around free in Pakistan. And unbeknownst to poor Danny, that was the guy that he met who claimed to be able to set up the interview with this Sheikh Jilani.
Oh, and so Danny didn't know who he was talking to. He had a fake identity.
Fake identity. And the guy was good because he had grown up he was born in the UK and grew up in the UK. So he spoke really good English. He wore spectacles. He had blue jeans and a collared shirt on, so he had all of the pretense of like a respectable middle class type of kid who just
he looked safe.
Yeah, seemed safe. So that's how this guy, Omar Sheikh, lured Danny to Karachi, saying that the interview would be in Karachi.
Why do you think they targeted him?
Well, the thing is that I've definitely identified from all my reporting is that they didn't target him. He was what they call in crime a target of opportunity.
Mm-hmm.
So Danny was looking for this sheikh, and his fixer, they call the local journalist who helped them, his fixer had called a jihadi group named Harkat al-Mujahideen. And when the kid who picked up the phone answered, the journalist fixer for Danny told him, oh, I have a journalist who's looking to interview the Sheikh Jilani. And Omar Sheikh was in the room at the time and heard this and said, okay, I've got a target. Like I can set this up. And then he poor thing, Danny just fell into this trap that Omar then set.
Looking back at it, we know what ended up happening, but was the plan from the get-go to do what they did?
There's definitely no clear indication that the intention was murder, but that was the outcome. And
because a lot of times people take hostage in order to exchange for someone, like, or to get money, obviously, or to get notoriety. It was the first time it ended in such a terrible
way.
Yeah.
So Omar Sheikh had a whole list of demands, but we never got the phone call for negotiating any of these terms. And they were outlandish. Maybe for a terrorist, they make sense. Free every prisoner in Guantanamo. They literally wanted these F-16 fighter jets that the US had not delivered to Pakistan. They did want a few prisoners here and there freed, but we never got a phone call for negotiation.
So how did you find out about these demands?
So Danny, poor thing, then he didn't come back. Like Marianne had this big dinner that she'd cooked, and I had invited all my new friends, and he never came. And oh my gosh, it was just shocking for us, right? Like we ran to his computer finally when we realized that something was weird. and I sat at his keyboard.
And so
Didn't
you
even
just kept
have,
calling him and he didn't pick
yeah,
up.
Marianne
And
kept calling him all evening and kept getting the recording that the phone was not on. And I went straight into his emails and I started seeing this communication that he'd been having with this guy, this named Bashir. And that was the fake name that Omar Sheikh used. And the moment my heart just dropped was when I looked at his emails and I saw the email address for Bashir. And what Omar Sheikh had used as his email address was no but mashi at yahoo.com. And I was like, oh my effing God, I didn't teach Danny that word. I had taught him how to say, do you think I'm an owl to taxi drivers? Because in India, Pakistan, an owl is actually considered dumb. And so you say, do you think Ulu is the word for owl? And so I taught him Ulu because if he's getting ripped off by a taxi driver, I wanted him to be able to say, do you think I'm an owl? So I taught him that. I taught him this and that, but I didn't teach him the word badmash. And a badmash is a troublemaker. It's like a bad guy in Bollywood movies, like the guy with the long mustache that's diabolical. And I was like, oh my God. So this person that's setting up an interview with Danny for a shake is using no badmashi at yahoo.com. I was like, there's no reason, like that makes no sense. And I was like, felt so bad. Like I felt so bad that I hadn't seen his emails, that I could have just said, oh, I don't know, that's like a red flag for me, just cultural cue. So
like, as in someone who is serious wouldn't use such a word, or
yeah,
what is it?
exactly.
Yeah.
Like you would never, like a mother scolds a little boy and says, don't be a badmash. It's like nothing you own or claim for yourself. And especially like this is a supposed so religious leader that Danny's going to be meeting. So like his disciple is using no badmashi. It would totally not make sense.
Okay.
So poor Danny, he went off for that interview though, like journalists do, and we didn't know what had happened until the 27th, which was the first day that we got this email ransom note, and this would been sent to um, journalists all around the world, and that's how we first knew that Danny had been kidnapped, because they had what you call sign of life photos, and this was the photo of him with a gun to his head, his hand in chains,
And he was
sitting
holding
in
a newspaper, right? That of that day.
sign of life, exactly, so that you know that this person was alive on this day, and that newspaper had been published, after the 23rd.
Yeah.
And so that's when we knew that this was serious.
And the response was overwhelming. Like President Bush spoke, like all over the world, the response was crazy. Like everything was thrown to save him.
Yes, everything was thrown except, not enough. The FBI jetted to Karachi, the prime minister, president, but it wasn't enough. And we didn't even know, but Danny had been killed probably within 1 week. And we didn't know for 5 weeks because it took that much time for them to edit this ridiculous, absurd, horrible video documenting Danny's murder and figure out their distribution plan, like how they were going to get it to the world. They didn't have the internet uploads like we do today. I think YouTube might not have even been a thing.
I'm so sorry for your loss, and I know
Oh,
it's so
thank you.
difficult
Thank you.
to talk. I know you can't see, but I am getting teary-eyed and I have a knot in my throat because I can imagine, I cannot really, I can only imagine. I don't know, can I even imagine what was the terror of that moment?
Yeah, terror is a good word because like I've never, and this is like back to what we learn, how we learn to be what we are, and I never did allow it to like be process as terror, even though that's what it was. I didn't. If I did, then I would be paralyzed, right? And so that's where I really learned how we dissociate to cope too, how we separate to survive. Because if I had actually, just surrendered to the terror and the fear and the reality, then I would have just curled up in a ball, right? And been like immobile.
Were you able to watch that tape? How did you receive it?
Well, we received it through the FBI.
So the militants didn't send it to the media.
They thought they were delivering it to a journalist
Oh,
because we got word that they had a video to deliver. And then the FBI agent just pretended to be an executive with a media state outlet. They watched the whole video and they arrived at my house. And we didn't know this. We didn't know what was going on. They just sort of all disappeared. And they all arrived at my house. They knocked at the door. And these men, these grown men who have seen everything of the worst in this world, oh my God, their like faces were just crestfallen. They literally looked like they'd seen a ghost. And that was when this Pakistani police officer who had been leading the investigation told Marianne, I'm sorry, I couldn't bring your Danny home. And that was, the moment then that we learned that Danny had been murdered.
and so you watched the tape then?
I didn't actually. I didn't watch it that night. They wouldn't give it to me. I'm the investigative mind. A lot of people won't be able to understand it and would even judge it. But I'm the kind of person that had to see the evidence, right? Like I have to see it firsthand because I have to see the clues to the murderer. I have to know what is it that Danny lived in those last seconds. So they didn't let me watch it. They didn't give it to me that day. They described it because I insisted, how do you have proof? But then years later, for the investigation into the details about Danny's kidnapping and murder, I did watch it. And I did watch it again and again and for clues. And I think, again, it's something that is hard to explain, but there was this part of my brain that had reacted to, I can't say this is part of my brain, but my brain had reacted to this by, dissociating, this word that I keep referring back to, by compartmentalizing. And so when I watched it, I watched it not as like my friend there losing his life, but just to understand, just to have a clue into him
and into them, like
into them, exactly. And for me it was into them.
What did they have him say?
Well, they had Danny relate the identity of his family, the journey that his family had made to Israel. Well, they didn't know all of these details, of course. So Danny himself related that this grandparent of his, Haim Pearl, had come to Israel before it was Israel, creating this town called Bnei Brak, where they had the street named after his ancestor. He related in his last words, then, my father is Jewish, my mother is Jewish, I am Jewish. And I felt like in those moments, because Danny knew anyway, like Danny knew the dangers of being Jewish among extremists for sure.
Mm-hmm.
And so his volunteering that information and relating it to me was a fusion of his identity in his existence, in all that he was. And I just really feel like he could have run, you know what I mean? He could have run from who he was at that moment. He could have disavowed Israel.
Yeah.
He could have done a lot, but he didn't. Even when the poor prisoners have to do that, like I know it's more complicated than a identity thing because it's existential, because you have to do whatever you can to survive.
Of course.
But by some alchemy of that moment, Danny didn't deny any of his identity, and he owned it and he embraced it. And I really admire him for that, leaving that for his family also, and for his parents, and for the world to be able to see that you can, even in the face of such adversity and challenge, just be who you are.
And that tape, and it's odd for me to talk about it because it was such a huge story here, and I did not know about it until I started preparing for our conversation,
Oh, wow.
because
Okay.
at the time I was living in Russia.
Yeah, it must have been shocking for you to go back and read these details of Danny's case. You're like, wait, how did I miss this?
Yeah,
Right?
it was. It was. Well, I also was, I mean, younger. I was just in college and not necessarily so plugged in to the news, but it was, I was surprised to find out as I was preparing to see how big of a story it was here and how impactful it was.
Yeah, yeah. And there was something about Danny that I think really pierced any
Cynicism.
cynicism, yeah, that people have. And I want to tell people, having read every single email of his that I could have possibly found, that the sincerity that people feel about him is 100% on. There's no skeletons in his closet of like the real Danny that was this way or that way. I mean, he was really like the stand-up guy that I knew, even when I poured through his text messages and emails, um, because there then I saw like, man, this guy, like he just like approached everything like the wit and humor and the whole like, that's when I saw again the email that he'd sent, that was just casual after the 9/11 attack, like, oh yeah, there's this war going on, but can I still look for a husband for you? Because it was a dark, dark moment for people, but he was still always trying to like find some humor, find some goodness in all of it.
And so, what was it like for you to find yourself in that
Oh my gosh.
storm, besides your personal situation? Like, so much attention to this story and such a big deal.
Yeah, I learned a number of lessons.
How did you navigate that? Because you were not a public person necessarily, even though you were a journalist.
Yeah. Oh yeah. That's true. Like back then too, as journalists, as print journalists, we never went on TV for anything because if we did, that would blow our cover if we did some big investigative story.
Mhm.
So, there was no concept of like the, the journalists going on CNN and talking about their story for 3 minutes like there is today.
Mhm.
There's a couple things that I learned. One was that we as journalists do need to be a little bit more self-aware about the impact of our work. Like, because I would deal with journalists now reporting the story, and they would want to know every detail of the investigation and the leads and the this and the that. And finally, from the other side, I could see like, I don't want any of those details out. I don't want anything out. I don't want anyone getting a scoop on anything because we got to catch the bad guys. So
Mhm.
I suddenly understood when people want to keep things quiet, which was the exact opposite of everything that I believed until then. But now I was like ticked off when people over-reported and
Mm.
especially reported details about the investigation. Um, like, just the one detail that Danny was Jewish ended up leaked and put into the Pakistani newspaper. And when we saw that in the newspaper, the next morning, we were just like devastated. And
Why? Why
Marianne,
was that such a?
well,
Um,
Marianne just responded, with the truth, which was that it was like a death sentence because the anti-Semitism and hate of Jews was so profound, among extremists that they would use it, as they did as the excuse to kill Danny.
oh, so that was before you knew what
Yes, that was
happened. Oh,
before we
okay.
knew what happened. That was like an example where I realized, wow, journalists can like screw things up too for people. Like I kind of really got a sense of the responsibility that
Mhm.
we have to something other than the quote story.
And
That
truth.
yeah, yeah. I mean, because these are all truths, but you should definitely not engage in lying, but there's also times
Timing.
for different, yeah, exactly. So I learned that. I learned really deeply. That's when I, became a Muslim reformer and a Muslim feminist because that's when I realized like the sexist, violent interpretations of Islam had to go. And when I saw the consequence with Danny's murder, I had clarity.
Let me ask you this, because I'm agnostic
Oh, yeah.
and I grew up in post-Soviet Russia, which was atheist. Soviet Union was atheist, and I'm of Jewish descent, but my mother wasn't Jewish, so I had that identity uh, conundrum to resolve for myself. But I did have a period of search for myself and in the world of religion and spirituality. And for me, that ended up with, after spending 5 months in Jerusalem, I would say I became atheist.
Oh,
Because to me, I could not reconcile so much hate that religion brings with myself and with what I was searching for.
yeah.
And obviously, you come from a completely different space into that. You grew up with religion and faith. But I can imagine that in that moment when people who claimed to be devout Muslims first killed your friend in such a horrific way and used his death for their cause, and then also on a personal level, that guy who you were seeing abandoned you
Right.
so cowardly. And I can imagine that would challenge your faith a lot.
Yes. Yeah.
How did you not give up on God in that moment?
Yeah. I definitely changed my relationship with faith. My answer was a different one to fight within my faith, because I knew that my faith was not going to go away. And I knew that this fight had to happen. But the reason why, like, it just stayed within me was because it was the safety net that I'd had spiritually as a child in times of trouble. Like when I didn't speak even of this girl Barbara leapfrogging on my shoulders as a little girl, I would pray. I would pray for peace of mind. There's this word we have, sukoon, which means peace of mind. And I would open my hands as a little girl and I would pray for peace of mind.
Mm-hmm.
When we moved, I had to leave my little rabbit, Buffy Nibbles, behind in New Jersey when we moved to West Virginia. And I would pray for Buffy to be safe. And it was my safety net. Some people could just say that's like my indoctrination, right? And I would even say that because I was just indoctrinated into faith. But it's what I knew. Became part of my reflexive response to stress, even though I'd been on the path of Buddhism and Hinduism. When I was confronted with this worst horror of my life, the Pakistani cops and the FBI officers came to the door to tell us that Danny was dead. Marianne screamed like this blood-curdling scream and ran to her room and locked it. And I sat outside on the stairs and I said, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, in the name of God, the beneficent, the merciful. And I started this chapter that I had learned since I was a little girl from my mother for protection, because I wanted protection for Marianne and I wanted protection for her unborn baby. That was my default. That was my reflex. And in the next weeks, that's where I returned, even though I had so much anger, right? Like I had so much rage. I'm not going to pretend like I wasn't really ticked off. People say that like you have clarity when it becomes personal to you about different issues or different things in this world. So I'd known since my childhood about this growing extremism within Islam.
Yeah.
I grew up with it in the 70s, and then especially 79 after the Saudis and Iran started having their competition, out extreming each other. So how I think of it sometimes, like out trying to outdo each other. And then they exported their Shia and Sunni extremism to communities, including mine in Morgantown, West Virginia. Like I saw it growing up, because then the Saudi students would come with their ridiculous Saudi interpretations of the Quran. They would change the rules at our potluck dinners and make it so that the men got the big room and the women had to go sit in this studio apartment with the kids, suffocated without any food and drink except when the men brought it to the door, and I'd lived through 9/11. But then the moment I saw these, just awful human beings use the religion to slay my buddy, I was like, okay, I will fight this ideology till I die, because it took a great human being from this earth, and it has to disappear. Like it has to go the ways of all bad ideas. Like there was a time during the Catholic Inquisition so that they could kill Christians, right? Their own fellow Christians. At different points, religion has been used to kill people. And every time it keeps reemerging. But at least for my generation, I was like, this is our task. And look at where we are though today. I mean, it's a combination of politics and money. Let's be honest, it's not just like good intentions, but we're now at a place where Muslim nations are recognizing the state of Israel. We are at a place where Saudi government is confronting their anti-Semitism in their textbooks. It's not. I don't ever. You'll see in all of this, all these dramatic headlines over these past months of advancement. You'll never once see me saying, "Oh, good job," and "thank you," or applause emoji, nothing, because I'm like, we're just doing what needed to have been done. If we are doing anything right, it's our mea culpa. We should ask the world for forgiveness for putting out this ideology of extremism. And that's made me very unpopular, right, among a lot of my Muslim crowd.
I was just going to ask you, like, what was the response to you as a woman starting to question things?
We're a shame-based culture, so they circled the wagons. They were like, you're the troublemaker, you're causing problems, you're embarrassing our religion, you're dishonoring us. Why are you, this isn't what true Islam is. And I was like, I don't care about the true anything. I care about the reality of what we're seeing in the world. And in the face of all that, I think it didn't matter to me whatever names they've called me and how unpopular it is, because like a shining light before me is Danny, like he's not here because this network of men infused their work with this ideology of hate, and that we have to own it. It had to happen. So now today we see a Me Too movement among Muslim women. We see women joining the call that I made 20 years ago for women's rights in mosques. It's not at all where we need to be, but it's better than 20 years ago. Though 20 years ago was worse than 50 years ago, because it was, it was before all of this political Islam had become a weapon by government.
So do you feel that historically the Islam has made the turn?
I think so, because so many of these Muslim countries are run by dictatorships or kingdoms, or but whatever they call themselves, they're not democracies. And so even then, like in a democracy, the whole movement for political Islam is so strong that I don't even know that we could win with progressive ideas in a democracy. Just like Egypt is a perfect example, because the Muslim Brotherhood was so strong there and so more advanced than progressive democratic movements.
Well, yeah, I mean, the problem starts right there, where there is no separation of church and state. Like that's where democracy kind of ends.
And that's where
the way I see it.
Yeah, I see it too that way. And democracy can never win in a situation where you have a fusion of church and state, because the church will just dominate. They'll just use every lever of power that they have, and they will use God, right, as the ultimate election judge.
That's what worries me about America a lot.
Yeah. I mean, I'm as opposed to like Christian theocracy, as I am Muslim theocracy. We created this movement that we call Muslim Reform Movement. And in that movement, secular governance is a critical component, because we've seen that political Islam and all of the institutions created around it are used to suppress people, and especially women, in expressing ideas that would otherwise be legitimate in a democracy, because then they use religion to shut you up because you're saying something against Islam, or you're saying something against a royal family who's descendant of the prophet of Islam. They use all the excuses to basically suppress a democracy, including women's rights. So, a woman can only vote if she's covered from head to toe, so then you're like, there's just so many absurd ideas. Forget vote, right? Like in Afghanistan, like walk the streets.
Yeah.
So that's
Or get education or travel
yes.
or drive.
So you can't claim that's a democracy when a citizen doesn't have their full rights of self-determination.
Well, here's my question there as an agnostic, as a non-religious person. My concern always is, well, how can you truly reform a religion staying within it if by default there is the dogma, there is the text that kind of rules the whole thing? Like, how can you reform it from within, staying true to it?
Yeah. Well, I think, once I learned fancy words like hermeneutics, the study of sacred text. And so I learned that even when you study sacred text, there's many different approaches. You can take a literal approach, and this is true in law too, right?
Yeah.
I take the same approach that lawyers take to legal interpretation, to religious interpretation. And so within legal interpretation, you're still working within case law, within the words that are written down in a constitution, for example, but you may interpret it differently, right? Like when you say all men are created equal, at some point, it's not just all men, right? It becomes all men and women, boys and girls. And it's not just me, but it's like all religious scholars look at faith from the lens of interpretation. That's why we have schools of theology. That's why we have schools of jurisprudence, even in Islam. Like, for example, the inheritance. So like in the Quran, a girl was given less inheritance than a boy because the girl was supposed to get the financial protection from the man she married. And so it wasn't supposed to be hereditary, right? So then now we have girls that don't get married. We have girls that get divorces, we have split assets in marriages.
Mm-hmm.
So we got to move along with that time. And so that's one of the arguments used today to give women, daughters and sons equal inheritance. And so you move forward and you say, okay, for the 7th century, that was the interpretation, but for the 21st century, this is how we move forward on the intention of that text. And then another example, like I have a dog now in my house. I have a pet. It's the first time in our ancestry that we have a dog as a pet, because we inherited this hadith that was related to the saying of the Prophet Muhammad that no angels will visit a home in which a dog is living.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but I think I saw on your Instagram, you allowed your dog to lie on your prayer mat.
Yes, my dad does. My dad does. Like
your dad.
Yeah, my dad. I do too, but most importantly, my father does, because my father prays 5 times a day. He has a little mark on his forehead from touching the prayer rug so often. But he's the guy who thought this, that you couldn't have a dog. Well, now there's challenges to that hadith, that it's not legitimate, and that dogs now get rabies vaccinations, and that we walk our dogs and they don't pee in a corner of our house. That it was because of cleanliness back then and health, because they didn't have vaccinations, they didn't have flea collars, right?
Yeah.
So dogs were considered like in a rural society, a traditional society, like they have a job to do, but they're not your pets. But now Lily is a part of our family. She's in our holiday photos, and she indeed does love to lie down on my dad's prayer rug. She can probably feel like the warmth of his, touch on it or something like that.
His smell.
Yeah, his smell. Yes, exactly. I didn't think about that. His scent is on it. Exactly.
It's his place. She knows that he's with him on that spot. But that's crazy, kind of. Like, I mean, a lot of Muslims would not approve of that. When I saw this, and I'm not Muslim, and I saw this, I'm like, wow, that's radical.
Yeah. And then there's my mom, who grew up in a conservative family. She literally wore the face veil as the interpretation that what girls had to wear. Well, in America, she took off the scarf by choice. She raised me with this other argument that I make within Islamic feminism, that women are not obligated to cover their hair. And that's a radical idea to so many of these Muslim political organizations that want to keep us covered, and government. But my mom, she's the best. So she's I don't she's the one who's always encouraged me that like religion has to have common sense in it. And so I told her, "Oh, Mom, there's all these people who aren't going to come to our house now because we have Lily in it." And she's like, "Good. I don't want them here anyway."
I love it. Your mom is such a rock star. I know we've gone way, way over
Yeah.
the time that we
Yeah.
were supposed to, but I do want to get to the last bit there with Danny's story. Tell me what's going on. Why all of a sudden Danny's story is coming back to the news?
In June 2002, the anti-terrorism court in Pakistan convicted 4 men in Danny's kidnapping and murder. One of the men was the man who laid the trap for Danny, leading to his murder. And his name was Omar Sheikh. And so Omar and these 3 co-conspirators were convicted of terrorism in 2002. So 18 years later, in the midst of COVID, 2 judges in Karachi ruled in an appeal of that 2002 decision that 3 of the men were completely innocent and that Omar Sheikh was only guilty of abduction, not even kidnapping, and not terrorism. And so this ruling was just a shock to us. It was one that we did not expect. And so since April, Danny's parents have been fighting to keep these 4 men in jail. They have hired a Pakistani criminal attorney, and he has filed an appeal of that ruling in this Pakistani Supreme Court. So to our shock, as that hearing is continuing in Pakistan Supreme Court, those 2 judges from the lower court again ruled on Christmas Eve that the men should be freed. And we're just about ready to free them when the government stepped in and said that, they're going to appeal that freedom until the Supreme Court case is concluded. And so we're just, living a nightmare as we're trying to make sure that we can realize justice for Danny, because every day, we wonder whether these 4 men will be freed. And in that part of the world, though anywhere, of course, people can just disappear and not be held responsible. So this week in the Pakistan Supreme Court, Danny's parents' attorney will be going back to court in order to argue that those 4 men should stay in jail.
Right. How is it? I don't fully understand, like within the court system of Pakistan, why would these 2 judges make that decision all these years later and go back on the decision?
I'll tell you how it makes sense logically, but it should have been dealt with immediately, is that the case has been under appeal. So what happened is the appeal was never heard. And actually, one of the reasons it was not heard was because the defense attorneys wouldn't show up to court. Like, I literally would get the orders about hearings being delayed so often that I started tuning it out in my own mind, because I was like, this is not going to happen. And it was the defense attorneys who would say, oh, we have a wedding to go to and we can't represent our, this is so classic, represent our client in court, or, oh, one attorney is sick and so we can't fully have our representation there, on and on. And so it was just explained to me that one of the reasons why that happened by the defense side was because they were waiting for the right moment.
For the noise to die out, kind of?
For the noise to die out and to get judges that would be sympathetic.
Oh, so these judges are more in line with the terrorists? I mean,
yeah, it's really a disturbing notion. I haven't been able to establish their motivation, but I do know that the one judge in particular, KK Agha, He is a British Pakistani judge that has very minimal criminal background. And so he actually just came to leaps of conclusion that were not grounded in good, even criminal law analysis. And so they found maybe a judge with the right level of ignorance about that kind of law to be able to further their case. I have, I'm a journalist, so I can't speculate about something that I haven't been able to report out, but
Right.
I'm still trying to report it out. And of course, I have the same questions as everyone, which is he politically corrupt? Is he, sympathetic? I don't think that he's ideologically sympathetic, but ultimately, like what we hope is that the Supreme Court will reject his analysis.
Wow. And what is the American response right now?
This last couple of weeks have been really deep because the second judgment came out that these four men should be freed, and the world awakened, to the tragedy that would represent. So that was really important and good for me to see, actually. And the US government also responded really aggressively, saying that if Omar Sheikh is freed, then they want to extradite him.
Which body? Where did the response come from?
The responses come from the State Department and the Justice Department. Omar Sheikh was indicted for the kidnapping in 2002 and in 1994 in India. And he had kidnapped an American citizen there also.
Mm-hmm.
And so the acting attorney general in the US issued a statement that Omar Sheikh would be indicted if he's freed from Pakistan.
And so how that would unfold, like technically, would America just send a request to Pakistan and Pakistan would have to, in the spirit of collaboration and all the international treaties, arrest him on behalf of American authority? Or how does that going to work?
Yeah, I mean, with an extradition, right, you put the request into the government and then the government can either honor your extradition request or not. And it does, matter what your relations are, and it does impact, your future relations. America did extradite the mastermind of the first World Trade Center attack from Pakistan. Yeah, so we have some precedent, of individuals that have been extradited. We did extradite this Pakistani who was responsible for the killing of some Americans outside the CIA headquarters. So we have some precedent. It's critical to Pakistan's future that they handle this case well. And so we hope will do the right thing.
As in keep them in prison.
And keep them in prison, yeah.
And when will we hear about that?
So we will hear the Supreme Court's decision this month, the month of January 2021. But a few things could happen. They could make a decision to keep them in jail. They could decide that no, they will be freed, or they could actually send the case back to the lower court to hear again.
Oh, God.
Just sort of starts the cycle all over again of the trial. So all options are on the table in terms of how we'll respond. But I think, no matter what, like what I learned this year is that vigilance is required. Like there's a saying, I guess, this idea that you have to be forever vigilant in, advocating and fighting for your values and your truths and the sense of justice that you want on any kind of issue or any kind of topic. And so that's what I realized, like, this is going to be lifelong for me and will probably be inherited by younger ones, because Omar Sheikh is now in his mid 40s and he's a young man and he could live a long life, always trying to get out of jail. And so I've already, asked the younger lawyers to pay close attention to the details so that they can wage this fight for decades to come.
Wow.
And it's like all like crimes against humanity. Just that saying, never forget, is important because that's part of continuing to stand up for what's right. It's in your life, right? Like, I don't know the word, I'm kind of missing out on the words, but it's like you don't just move on, like, and you don't just leave it behind. I mean, it's sort of like I'm just
Well, for
connecting
you,
to
it's such a life-defining story. I mean,
yeah, yeah. But you have a choice, right? Like I could have just compartmentalized it and I could, but I chose it. I chose to fuse it into my life. And I think that that's what I I realize now is I was on that journey, like you're saying, of fusing the different parts of my life and not compartmentalizing. And so, as we were talking and we talked about like how even in immigration, you leave the old country behind, or you leave this old grief behind, or you think that you're going to compartmentalize this grief
mhm.
that's happened, or this trauma that's happened. And that's what this moment represented for me, right? It was a grief, it was a trauma, and it was in another land, right? And then I made another migration back to America for safety with my own baby in my belly. And I could have said, like, I'm out of this, right? Like I'm over this. Like this is not going to be my future. But I chose to integrate it, and I'm like for good and for bad, right? Like, and I have to always keep it in balance because I'm always thinking every day, like I don't want to just live in the past, right? Because that's the other thing that can happen if you too fused, right, to something in an unhealthy way. So always every day, like honestly, every day, I do a check on it because I'm like, okay, am I like living in Pakistan time zone and living in the past, or am I spending the right amount of time with my son and my relationships and my mother and going for a run in this present, right? Because that's what it means to be present also. Yeah. But when I think about being present, I think too that it's also including things from your past in an integrated way,
Yeah, for
And
sure. And if
yeah,
there is a silver lining to this story being brought back in well, wish in a different way, but people wouldn't really pay attention to something that happened 19 years ago otherwise, and major news outlets wouldn't be paying attention if it wasn't such a important thing. If there is a silver lining to any of that, it's some people who maybe have not been paying attention then, or maybe were born after, because it was so long ago. Now, there's a whole generation of people who maybe were born already, but we're not following the news. But now they're reintroduced to this story. And I'm really grateful to you for sharing it with me and me having the opportunity here to kind of present it in full. That's why I was asking you all those questions to describe in detail, like what your relationship was and how did it happen and what impact it had, because I feel that people need to hear this story and they
right.
have an opportunity to sort of go back to it now because it's brought back into the attention,
Yeah, you're
into the
right.
eye of the public.
Yeah, like when I had my son, I had him here in America in West Virginia, and I gave him the name Shibli, which means my lion cub, which is a really great name until he turned about 7, and he's like, I'm no one's cub, I'm a lion. Um, but I
I
gave him
can
the middle name.
imagine.
Yeah, right. I gave him the middle name of Daniel, which is a version of Daniel, and I raised him with stories about Danny, uncle, right? So I always raised him telling him these stories, like the fun stories, and later when it became appropriate, telling him stories explaining his death. But I do want people to know Danny Uncle, especially these kids that were everybody who was born afterwards, because he represents like goodness and friendship and purity and joy that is timeless, right? It's timeless values that matter.
Absolutely, but at the same time, he also represents the transition and kind of, well, there was this, obviously there was 9/11 attacks, but there, as you mentioned, like he was investigating the story of the shoe bomber. We all take
Yes,
off shoes. Nobody even asks why.
that's why I wanted to
But
explain to
that's
kid.
that's the moment
Yeah,
when it happened, and here's a person who was investigating this situation, and his kidnapping and his murder is this kind of the transition from, together with 9/11, the transition from the life before to the reality that we have now.
yeah. Oh my gosh, I know. And I think we have to understand that because then we can understand where we're at today. Why do we have beheadings today? Where did that begin? What are the roots of it? Why do journalists now take, defensive driving courses? Why do they learn counter surveillance? It's because this marked a change in the way journalists now have targets on their back.
Yeah.
This is what we lose. These are the people that we lose. These are the bright lights in society that we lose. And let's remember them so that we keep people alive too, right?
Yeah.
That's
For sure.
and to keep people living in peace and and pursuit of self-determination, like all these values that we care about.
Yeah. I know we're super over time, and I would not forgive myself if I don't ask you. And I hope that you understand me and don't take it the wrong way.
Oh no, never would.
Another thing that is unfolding this week specifically is the transition of power in America, and that's probably the biggest story right now still. And so I know that in the previous election you voted for President Trump, and so if you could quickly, because for I've read your points on that and I understand where you were coming from, but I would like maybe if you could give a quick intro to that so that the audience understands, and then address where we're standing right now with the transition.
Yeah, so all the listeners know, the impacts of life that have that kind of, I think everybody understands pretty much like what matters to me. And so when we were entering into the 2016 election, I was very disappointed by the response by the Democratic Party to the threat of Islamic extremism in the world. They had decided to align with a movement in our Muslim communities that ascribe to political Islam, that make excuses for the extremists by arguing that it's not Islam. So they want to avoid the issue by protecting the honor of the religion. When I've always believed you honor the religion by actually fighting for what you believe within the religion is best. And so I was very frustrated with that relationship. And when I was going into the election, I decided to vote for Donald Trump because I saw in his candidacy somebody who was going to deal directly with the issue of Islamic extremism. And I said back then, actually at a conference of atheists, look, I know he's totally, not the kind of leader that I would wish for this country, but given the choices that I had at the time, that's who I voted for. And I said, he will get, for example, peace with Israel. I know that he will, because he's going to figure out a way how to make the art of the deal happen. And he's going to push these Muslim countries forward through money, probably, and business, so that they abandon the most misogynistic, intolerant interpretations and anti-Semitic interpretations that really repulsed me, and that I wanted our government to not just placate, but challenge. So sure enough, 4 years later,
Do you feel that he did that with Saudis?
Yeah, like I do believe he did do that with Saudi Arabia, and he's done it with the UAE. Like it's Muslim country politics that helped him. Like, I'm not arguing that from some genius that he was able to just pull that off, but they see Iran as such a threat that they are ready to align with Israel, to realize safety for themselves. And of course, Saudi's corrupt. Like, there's no doubt they are responsible for the killing of Jamal Khashoggi, and who's writing columns for the Washington Post when he was killed. And they have women's rights activists in jail. So that's why I say, like, and they're still a dictatorship, and the UAE is a financial dictatorship, of ruling families. But we have, movement on that front, and we didn't allow the Muslim Brotherhood types more entree into our governance. But extreme of Donald Trump did empower those groups even more within America in a way that is very disturbing and troubling to me now as we go into the next administration. And what I'm talking about is the rise of politicians in America like Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib, and then community activists like Linda Sarsour, who was the Palestinian American involved with the Women's March, resistance on Trump. So the extreme of Donald Trump led to, I consider, unholy alliances and dangerous alliances with Muslim groups in the US.
Well, he also empowered the white supremacy.
Yeah, so that's another, extremism, and that, of course, is a threat and a reality. They, perhaps, because of like my own lens, right? I'm paying attention to the Muslim side of what I see also. So that's a negative. But as we go into this next administration, the stuff that I'm watching that causes me concern is whether the Islamist groups, including, organizations within the United States with alliances with political Islam overseas, get a front door now into the White House. So for everybody who has been concerned legitimately about Donald Trump's, supporting white supremacists, like they should also have the same type of concern about a new administration supporting Muslim supremacists. Because if you have like intellectual consistency, right, then you're going to also be worried about any type of extremism.
Yeah.
And definitely during the Trump administration, I mean, I am opposed to radical Christianity or ultra conservative Christianity. And so what I've always said was like a vote is not like a love letter, so it's not like a marriage forever or a unconditional love either. And so there's so many problems that Donald Trump had obviously during his presidency, not least of which a really critical moment for me, of course, is of epiphany to me also was I realized how much national security defines my vote. And so, but my vote in 2016 was related to the Islamic threat. And then in 2020, obviously the number one national security threat became COVID-19. And so when Donald Trump just bumbled his way through that response, that was like my moment of, hey, okay, this president is a threat, to our well-being and safety. And I will just say, to be, I think all of this stuff is complex, and I know there's a lot of people who are like 100% one way or the other related to presidents and politicians, but just I'll cast a vote, but just from being a journalist and being a thinker, right? I'll have many different lenses on things. And I do see a threat today in the US with the new ideology of critical race theory that is, taking over school systems from K through 12 and colleges and workplaces. Some of us in our Muslim community, we battle what we call political Islamism, and we call this wokeism. And it's its own extreme, and it's ultimately, to me, dangerous also to identity and existence, because it creates a new hierarchy of human value where all of a sudden Jewish people are considered white and thus not minority, and Asian kids in, STEM programs are considered white adjacent and thus not minority. I think that Joe Biden is a centrist Democrat, but I fear for the far left side of the party and the wokeists that will try to really change, it's this pendulum swinging, right? Like to swing the pendulum from Donald Trump's right to a far left. And the America that I believe in is, one of an inclusive humanity. I know that that's not been the case. Like I've lived it, I know it. It's not even in America that I believe in, but it's the world I believe in, right?
Right.
It's a world that is an inclusive humanity that gives people equal opportunity based on character, the content of their character, not the color of their skin or their religion or their gender, right? All of these things. So that's I fear that we're going to have this new hierarchy of human value that is destructive to not only our society, but like the individual psyche of children who all of a sudden, like if you're an immigrant kid from Eastern Europe and you look white, and you've gone through the same stories that like I went through as a girl of color, you don't matter. And that's where I say like an inclusive humanity honors the struggles of each person without creating a competition, right, of suffering. And I want no child to feel like they're less than, or there's a competition, or they should be ashamed of who they are because they're not this color or that color. And so that's what I think like we all have to work towards. And definitely, we're at like a challenging moment. And I hope that we can all like be fully self-realized that nobody has to compartmentalize part of who they are because they feel shame about it for the reasons of identity politics today.
Right. Well, any shame or guilt assigned because of identity is just not helpful.
Yeah, exactly. And
it will not serve the other group to shame or guilt the other one group.
Right, because you're just using the weapon of the oppressors then. I mean, really. And that's the moment that progressive movements are in right now to make sure that they don't repeat the negative values that they have rejected. Despite that vote, I'm still a registered Democrat. I'm still a flag waving liberal,
Well, I'm happy to hear that. And thank you for saying that, because I know that a lot of people assign a huge importance to that vote. And of course, every vote is very important and making a decision. But it is great. It's great to have you on our side. That's what I want to say, because we do need to keep balance, and keeping balance requires the courage to speak your mind. And I think that is one of the beautiful things that that America has created is democracy, an opportunity to challenge and discuss ideas.
Yeah.
And create a competition of for the best ideas to win. And I'm very happy to have you in that.
Yeah, thank you, because I appreciate you daring to go there on this topic, because people don't want to talk about people oftentimes don't want to talk to anybody who's voted for Trump. They want to people who don't like him, they compartmentalize there too. But you've allowed me to like fuse that part of myself too, because it's complicated. Like we're all complicated, and the only way to deal with it is with honesty. But the truth is that like after I wrote my op-ed, there's such a backlash and so much shaming and so much hostility and aggression. And honestly, like I wrote my op-ed after the vote, so that just the fact that I published it after the vote should reveal to people that I wasn't trying to change anybody's mind about the election or how to vote, but to help people understand those that voted for Trump so that they could integrate them into their understanding of America in a way that wouldn't be like us versus them. And it didn't work. It didn't work. I was a fool's errand. But that's because I had so much against me. There's such a movement against Trump, obviously, that like galvanized, it wanted to bifurcate people too. And so I just slipped away then on this. I didn't talk about it for all these years. Honestly, 4 years later, I've barely talked about it then, because I don't usually can find somebody who can accept it and hear it and understand it as a part of the entirety of who I am. And I'm at that point where I'm like, okay, I'm not going to fight it then, but I won't insist on it. I won't create new troubles for myself. But I'm happy that we are able to talk about it, because then it's it is part of my life and part of my identity, and it is part of what I bring into this next chapter of America. This kind of trying to keep things in balance. Really, that's what it is, keeping it in balance. Because anybody of real liberal progressive values, I think, cannot really live with a society that's off balance. That's
you
oppressive
don't
against
want
anyone.
you don't want to be in that society. That's for sure. I come from one of those. I know.
Exactly. And that's why voices like yours, to me, also, just to say, are so important. Like, I've learned so much from immigrant families and that have come from China, that have lived that reality there. And I feel like the immigrants that came from Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Republic have a wisdom that we have to hear. Like, they've lived totalitarian, they've lived oppressive, and they give us balance. And yeah, your stories matter. So I thank you for.
Thank you. I've had such a great time, and I really appreciate you being so open and willing to go to those tricky destinations emotionally and intellectually. And I hope that people get through this, and I'm sure they will get a lot out of this.
Oh, thank you. Thanks so much, Sasha. You're a gift to the world.
Oh, thank you.
You are.
That's it for today. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope it was interesting. I'm really curious to hear what you guys think, so shoot me a message, let me know. And share this show with a friend. In the view of last week's events, and in the anticipation of the coming weeks and really months and years of tension, I think that this conversation can actually be of value. America is divided and will remain divided. And I think we all know that yelling at the other side doesn't get you much further in any kind of negotiation. We have to look for a common ground with the other side, and we really have to hold on to it. Opposing extremism of all colors is a solid ground to hold on to. And I hope you can find a person on the other side to talk to. I hope you can hear them. And I hope they can hear you. Because we have to keep talking. And so maybe share this episode with a friend or a loved one on the other side. And remember, we're here to stay. We'll find our way. Thank you for listening. Have a great week. Stay safe. Love you all. Peace.
My country, you can keep the rest. This is my country, my damn country, and it don't mean a thing.